Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Dead Ladies Project, Exiles, Expats, and Ex-Countries by Jessa Crispin. Narrated by Amy McFadden. Prelude, Chicago. There are two Chicago cops standing in my kitchen. They are here to take me away, and I am trying to talk them out of it. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job, though, as it is hard to form a logical argument when my primary focus is on moving slowly to position myself between the cops and my oven to block their view of my stovetop. I am, somehow, more embarrassed about the pot of macaroni and cheese from a box, the cheap one with the sickly orange powder, than I am about their reason for being here. The reason being that I made some threats against my life on the phone with a friend. After that, I kind of bailed. It is not that I did not mean them. I was in a pretty unwashed and terrified state. It's just that saying them out loud was not part of the plan, and I felt like I could avoid the consequences of the confession simply by turning off my phone. When my friend could not get me back on the line, she called my sister, who called the police. The police came to take me to the emergency room. The emergency room doctors would then lock me away in the psych ward for observation. And I did have a plan. The suicidal brain is good at only one thing, and that is constructing elaborate plans for doing away with itself. My plan included not telling anyone there was a problem, so that they would not interfere. Now that they had, I had to consider them in my decision. That untimely blurt is really messing things up for me. I tried to explain to the cops that I turned off my phone because it was important for me to stand weeping in front of the George Inness painting at the Art Institute, the one where the darkening world dissolves into an orange and yellow blur. Not because I was swallowing drain cleaner. I mean, I made dinner. Would I bother to make dinner if I were intent on ending it all? But I knew if they saw what I had made for dinner, they would cotton on to the fact that I had indeed given up on life. Maybe I could benefit from a short hospital stay, from some time to rest, and letting other people take care for a while. Jesus. Yes. I am so very tired. But I see too clearly the aftermath of treatment. A hospital bill that would push me further into debt. Medications I'd have to spend a year slowly trying to wean myself off. Then there is that recurring nightmare I have of being locked away, futilely trying to convince the authorities that I don't belong here. There's been some kind of mistake. I was clear on one thing. I needed a reason to live, a plan, and it had to come from within. I couldn't just let others help me find a new stability, or acceptance of my circumstances. It was my circumstances that were killing me. I was sure of it. This is how I know. No matter how securely I built my sound little structure, slowly accumulating income and a respectable writing CV, dating important men with an eye toward marriage, acquiring a varied and stimulating social life. The thought, I want to go home, would start termiting through the whole thing. How is this not my home? Is this really my life, or did someone else choose it for me? Is any of this really me at all? The questions would eat at my existence until the structure collapsed into despair again and again. Every 2 years, I would be back to this exact same spot, rebuilding my sad little sand castle in exactly the same way, surprised every time when the wave took it out. But I didn't know what else to do. I could not explain this to the police, so instead I explained that a friend was coming over, a lie, to stay with me until I got better. I explained that I would definitely make an appointment to see a doctor, a lie. I explained that I just got overwhelmed, but things were looking up. I showed calm resolve, stability, and sanity, until they got the hell out of my kitchen and went away. Perhaps the suicidal impulse was correct. But it wasn't my physical life that needed to be destroyed, only what I was doing with it. I would need guidance, but there wasn't anyone in my life I felt I could turn to. Not about this. Using my married, employed, insured friends' lives as markers for where my life should be was one of my contributing factors. That would have to go, too. It was the dead I wanted to talk to. The writers and artists and composers who kept me company in the late hours of the night. I needed to know how they did it. I'd always been attracted to the unloosed, the wandering souls who were willing to scrape their lives clean and start again elsewhere. I needed to know how they did it, how they survived it. I couldn't do it from here, this haunted little apartment with its collection of insects and rodents, with the neighbor who sometimes goes mad and tries to break through our adjoining wall with a hammer, where the sound of gunfire comes through the window every night. No. If I was going to approach these great men and women, I would need to do it on their territory. I would have to go to them, not expect them to show up here. Everything that was excess could be left. The Chicago apartment, the furniture, the books, the men, the social circle. There was only one thing worth keeping, and that was my work. A small literary magazine I had started a decade ago, and a handful of regular writing and editing gigs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fund train tickets and shoddy Central European sublets. And it was all portable. My whole working world existed on my laptop. It was myself that was stuck. I could unstick myself, I thought, if I started flinging the superfluous away. The only things I really needed, I could carry with me. I would take myself to Europe and bring as my offering some spirits and the entirety of my past. Yes, I needed to talk to the dead. Maybe now that I was nearing the end, maybe the dead would talk back. Berlin, William James. Here is the real core of the religious problem. Help! Help! William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. You're in Berlin because you feel like a failure. I had met this man all of 10 minutes ago, and he was already summing me up neatly. I made subtle readjustments to my clothing, as if it had been a wayward bra strap or an upwardly mobile hemline that had given me away. More likely, it was my blank stare in response to his question, "So, what brings you to Berlin?" He has had to do this a lot, I imagine. Greet lost boys and girls, still wild with jet lag, still unsure how to make ourselves look less obviously like what we are. We members of the third great wave of American expatriation to Berlin. This man before me was second on the list of names that everyone gets from worried friends when resettling overseas. Everyone I know in the city to which you are moving, not totally vouched for. I had lasted about a week before I sent emails tinged with panic to everyone on my list. He had been the first to answer. I must have blushed at the accuracy of his remark, because he immediately qualified it. Everyone who moves to Berlin feels like a failure. That's why we're here. You'll have good company. Still embarrassed, I scanned the menu for one of the 4 German words I had mastered, and, failing, pointed helplessly to a random item when the waiter returned. It would prove to be a strange Swiss soda of indeterminate flavor. It tasted like the branch of a tree, carbonated. It was not unpleasant. I had been shooting for something alcoholic, but I was already too laid bare to have admitting to a mistake and reordering left in me. At this moment, it seemed unlikely this American could commiserate. My own failings were too grandiose, the depths to which I had fallen too abysmal. I was narcissistic in my failings, and he looked like he was doing pretty okay. He sat across from me, confident, knowledgeable. He had ordered in German. The people in the restaurant had greeted him by name. He talked about artistic projects he was working on. He was certainly sweating less than I was on this hot July day. Later, a tale would unravel, one that mimicked the stories of so many of the Americans who had flocked here over the last decade. Unable to survive financially in New York without having to abandon their writing, their art, their music, they came to a city of cheap rents, national health insurance, and plentiful bartending jobs that could cover a reasonable cost of living. He had an apartment. It had hardwood floors. A failure? My eye. In contrast, there I was, 10 days into my new city and still stumbling around like a newborn calf. I was tired of being the person I was on an almost atomic level. I longed to be disassembled, for the chemical bonds holding me together to weaken, and for bits of me to dissolve slowly into the atmosphere. It was not a death wish, not really. Not anymore. I was hoping something in the environment, some sturdier, more German atoms, would replace them. Because there does seem to be something about Berlin that calls out to the exhausted, the broke, the uninsurable with pre-existing mental health disorders, the artistically spent, those trapped in the waning of careers, of inspiration, of family relations, and of ambition. To all those whose anxiety dreams play out as trying to steer a careening car while trapped in the back seat, come to us. We have a cafe culture and surprisingly affordable rents. Come to us, and you can finish out your collapse among people who understand. Let's say, for a moment, that the character of a city has an effect on its inhabitants, and that it sets the frequency on which it calls out to the migratory. People who are tuned a certain way will heed the call almost without knowing why. Thinking they've chosen this city, they'll never know that the city chose them. Let's say, for a moment, that the literal situation of a city can leak out into the metaphorical realm. That the city is the vessel, and we are all merely beings of differing viscosity, slowly taking on the shape of that into which we are poured. If that were the case, what to make of the fact that Berlin is built on sand? Situated on a plain with no natural defenses, no major river, no wealth of any particular resource, it's a city that should not exist. It can't be any wonder that Berlin has, for hundreds of years, no, longer than that, past Napoleon, past the medieval days when suspected witches were lined up at the city gates and molten metal was poured between their clenched teeth, past the whispers of the Romans that those who inhabited these lands were not quite human, back to the days of the people residing here, who are now known to us only by some pottery shards and bronze tools, been a little unstable. It would explain the city's endless need to collapse and rebuild, even as the nation that engulfs it marches on confidently, linearly. Perhaps its unstable nature is what beckons the unstable to its gates. The Lausitzer, the Jasdorf, the Semnonen, the nameless and the preliterate, a shifting bunch of conquerors and the conquered. On through invaders and defenders, and populations reduced by half in war, disease, and the destruction of whoever pulled the short straw for being the scapegoat this century. The process merely sped up in the 20th, oscillating madly through world wars and grotesque ideas, crashing economies, and blind eyes turned. It plays out seasonally as well here in the northern reaches of Germany. The lush highs of summer, everything green and tangled with a sun reluctant to leave its post at night and overly enthusiastically trying to rouse you from bed in the very early hours of the morning, crash endlessly down toward the darkness of the winter solstice. The trees that had been blooming in a state of fecund glory when I arrived in the city lost their leaves, revealing that the only things behind them were the endless concrete boxes of Soviet mid-century architecture. The sun shunned us and rarely peeked out from behind its thick cloud cover. When it deigned to, it gave off all the glow and heat of a porch light. The gray of the sky matched the gray of the buildings, matched the gray of the thick coating of ice that remained on the sidewalks all winter. I fell on it one night, or early one morning, I guess, a little worse for wear, accompanied by a man I met at a bar whose entire seduction strategy was just to follow me home, despite the fact that I kept trying to shoo him away like a stray dog. I was 6 months into my Berlin residence, and from my akimbo position, I threw the holy tantrum of a sailor-mouthed 2-year-old. Fuck this city! Fuck it! Why the fuck did I ever move here, god fucking damn it? You're strange, said the German man, still resolutely standing by. Help me up! That's when I took my William James essays off the shelf. I found in his works of philosophy a friend, a mentor, a professor, and some sort of idealized father. It was his works on the more mundane matters that I relied on. How to make changes in your life, how to believe you can make changes in your life, how to convince yourself to get out of bed in the morning, how not to be a worthless slug, rather than his more important pieces about war or whatever. James is now a bit of an odd fellow in philosophy, more widely influential than widely known. His theory of pragmatism and his groundbreaking work in the field of psychology make him something of a hidden mover. If you do seek him out, it's not generally in the way one reads Descartes or Kant or Nietzsche, as a refinement of the intellect or in the pursuit of one's studies. One finds James when one needs him. He makes quiet sense of the world in all its glories and deprivations, its calamities and its beauties. As a philosopher, James is able to hold all of the sorrow and violence and pain of the world in his mind and remain somehow optimistic. It doesn't wipe out the goodness of the world, it just sits beside it. It's no wonder, then, that people get a little religious about this agnostic philosopher, this man who can restore your faith in the world without necessarily bringing God into it. I sought out William James because I needed him. He and I were now separated by about a century of death, but we found ourselves occupying the same biographical eddy, bottoming out in Berlin. Here is how William James found himself in Berlin. A failure. He had tried and failed to become a painter, failed to become a doctor, failed to become an adventurer. He was not yet a writer, but he was almost certainly still a virgin. He was in his mid-20s and painfully aware that he had failed even in deciding what it was he wanted to do. He stood there, absolutely calcified with indecision and doubt, while his soon-to-be famous friends like Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. made decisions and started careers, and his soon-to-be famous younger brother Henry started his literary apprenticeship with The Atlantic. Whereas he fled. First to Dresden, and then to Berlin. He arrived under the pretext of furthering his education, but that may have simply been a way to convince his parents to pay for the trip, because, despite his advancing age, he had yet to make an income. At any rate, he failed to go to class, ever. Instead, he holed up in his Berlin guest house, learning German, training his telescope on the legs of the occupants of the all-girls school across the street, and failing to figure out a way to flirt with the pretty woman who played the piano downstairs. All the while in his letters to his brother, he was alluding to a daily battle not to do himself in. James lightly fictionalized this time in his life in varieties of religious experience, passing off the breakdown to someone he knows who told him about it. He's French, you don't know him. In that work, he described the sensation of his suicidal idol as desperation absolute and complete, the whole universe coagulating about the sufferer into a material of overwhelming horror, surrounding him without opening or end. Not the conception or intellectual perception of evil, but the grisly, blood-freezing, heart-palsying sensation of it close upon one, and no other conception or sensation able to live for a moment in its presence. And while his letters to his parents hint at some of this darkness, there he mostly chats about that other Berlin experience, the roast veal and the beer and the music and the philosophy. Here is how Berlin responded to William James's time in Berlin. They built a center in his name. At the place of his greatest misery and torment, they built a permanent structure. Although maybe at this point they couldn't help it. After all the documentation they had to do of the horrors of the 20th century, maybe now it's an unconscious reflex to throw up a memorial on the site of every trauma. Well, not really a structure, I guess. More like a small room. The minute I learned of the center's existence, I sent off an email to make an appointment. I expected a hall of philosophy on the university campus, maybe in that glorious red brick so many of the buildings in James's time had been constructed with. I scribbled the address down on a piece of paper, and I took the train to the outskirts, to the University of Potsdam campus. It's situated next to the Sanssouci and its gardens, the former playground of the Prussian king. While the main path through the gardens is still marked with magnificent elm trees, most of the grounds have been allowed to go to seed. It's not a tourist destination on par with Versailles, and so it is kept in only middling shape. There is a lovely rose garden, but that is surrounded by tangle and bramble. It's been let go in the Berlin way, all of those straight German lines blurring a little into chaos. Past the garden gates, into the campus, into the main philosophy hall, up the main staircase, down a hallway, to the left and then right, I came to my destination. It was a small door. The William James Center proved, despite its authoritative name, to be the work of one man, Herr Dr. Professor Louis Gunnarsson. Or is it Herr Professor Doctor? I should have remembered to look up the proper order before I left. It's Louis. Call me Louis. Luckily, Dr. Louis is Icelandic and not beholden to the German titling system. The center's archives are really just the contents of Dr. Louis's office. A desk, a computer, some bookcases. Dr. Louis is slight and sandy, and he has the wonderful awkwardness that comes with too many hours spent in the company of dead men. He is, he tells me, attempting to recreate William James's personal library as part of his administration of the center, so that he can be surrounded by the same books that surrounded James. It's a devotional act couched in a scholarly one. It is an act I can understand. Dr. Louis pours me a cup of tea, and we chat about our good friend William James. Up for discussion? A traumatic encounter with a prostitute, alluded to in letters to his brother and in a journal. He did, it seems, either lose his virginity to the prostitute, or, perhaps even more traumatically, fail to. "The poor dear," I say.
"Yes, quite. He was hopeless with women. It seems, though, that after he married Alice Howe Gibbons, the physical ailments he was treating in Berlin, the bad back and so on, disappeared."
Were they caused by the burden of a protracted virginity?
Perhaps. The poor dear.
I am keeping Dr. Louis from professional duties, but I don't care, and it appears he doesn't either. I imagine it might be a relief for him, as it is for me, to have someone to converse with about our favorite person. Or willingly converse, as I'm sure he inflicts William James on the people around him, like I do. "What do you make," I ask slowly, "of the fact that his first book wasn't published until he was 49? Part of William's freakout, Dr. Louis had mentioned earlier, sprang from an enormous need to be seen. By the public, by his friends, by his father. He wanted to assert his reality on the world, as he wrote in his letters, and it took approximately 20 years after writing that statement until he would.
"Surely not."
Dr. Louis starts, but then he does the math in his head.
"I guess I knew that, but had forgotten. I mean, and he could not have known he would eventually succeed."
We both sit quietly, drinking the dregs of our tea and feeling the long expanse of the years before us. The weight of uncertainty. Whether it'll be a late blooming, or whether the soil will prove to be infertile. Whenever James was corresponding with a colleague or an inquirer, Dr. Louis told me, he would request from them a portrait. It was important for him to see the whole of the person, at least a bit of their humanity, and not only their written representation. In that spirit, I have before me 2 images of William James. The first was taken around the time he moved to Berlin. He looks stricken, pale, and withdrawn. It is as if he had recoiled into a permanent flinch. He looks off to the side, unable perhaps to meet the camera's gaze. There is something fractured deep at the heart of him. In the other, it is a few decades on. There is gray in his beard, and his face is worn. He exudes charm, warmth, and wisdom. It is a William James in whose lap you want to sit and listen to stories. He is keeping some secrets, but he will share them if you draw near. It is the distance between these 2 photographs that is so fascinating. Not simply in age, but in substance of the man. Biographers are interested. I am interested in the Berlin breakdown because of the distance traveled between the 2 Jameses and the quality of the end result. It's a favorite myth in our culture that hardship makes you a better person, that it is merely the grindstone on which your essence is refined and polished. But the truth is that scarcity, depression, thwarted ambition, and suffering most often leave the person a little twisted. That is the territory where mean drunks and tyrannical bastards come from. Not so with James. He may have always been a little hopeless with women. He sent a series of hilarious and heartbreaking letters to his Alice in the months before their wedding, in a vein that will be instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever gotten a little sullen after a bottle of wine and decided to start texting. And the weight of depression did occasionally redescend, but he walked out of that phase with dignity and great compassion. He used his experiences, both the good and the ill, for the base of his incredibly humane body of work. So then what's the magic formula? Can his transition be distilled down to a scientific protocol to be reproduced at home in your own basement laboratory? Could we use William James's example to turn our respective chemical imbalances into alchemical processes?
There are persons whose existence is little more than a series of zigzags, as now one tendency and now another.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?